Pacifism, doing the enemy's job for them. Section: The tactics of pacifism. The petty bourgeois class interest can be observed not only in its ideological expression, but also in the concrete tactics and aims. The preconditioned rejection of violence under any circumstances, of course, considerably narrows the pool of tactics available, such as sit-ins, candlelight vigils, chanting songs, etc. That is all fine and well. Sure, a lot of fun for everybody, and clearly shows that those protesting are good people, morally vastly superior to their corrupt opponents. But unfortunately, we can conclude together with Orwell. Quote, despotic governments can stand moral force till the cows come home. What they fear is physical force. End quote. Gelderloos adds, quote, put simply, if a movement is not a threat, it cannot change a system based on centralized coercion and violence. End quote. That is exactly what the state is. It is not some neutral and benevolent entity worried for the well-being of society, but an instrument of class rule, eager to ensure its monopoly on violence. It does not do so out of an irrational, savage instinct. On the contrary, centralizing and institutionalizing violence is vital for the survival of the ruling class. If this state monopoly is challenged, the ruling class will react fiercely, as a plain look at the news or a history book shows. Beginning of quote. At the absolute best, strategies of this type will lead to an oppositional but passive majority, which history has shown is easy for an armed minority to control. Colonialism, for example. End of quote by Gelderloos. Insisting on exclusively nonviolent tactics, therefore, only ensures that any chance for real progress is effectively wasted, and that discontent is kept under control and directed into harmless channels. Thus, we can say that pacifists, far from challenging the ruling power, actually consolidate it. While governments all over the world react more and more violently to protests, questioning their policies, we are told to disarm, to not even think about the mere possibility of resisting violently. Gelderloos quotes another FBI memo to local police officers, explaining what constitutes an, quote, extremist. Quote, their most outstanding, terrible, and inexcusable characteristic is that extremists may be prepared to defend themselves against law enforcement officials. End quote. The depravity of these, quote, extremists knows no end. Listed are the wearing of sunglasses and scarves to minimize the effects of tear gas and pepper spray, using shields and body equipment for protection, and they even may, good God, use intimidation techniques such as videotaping and the swarming of police officers to hinder the arrest of other demonstrators. Needless to say that under such grave circumstances, quote, law enforcement officials should be alert to these possible indicators of protest activity and report any potentially illegal acts to the nearest FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. End quote. Luckily, the FBI and the law enforcement officials are not alone in their heroic struggle against these dangerous extremists. the strict adherents of nonviolence come to our rescue. Their rationale goes like this. Quote, since all violence is bad, and since extremists are obviously immoral people threatening the whole movement with their thirst for violence, they have to be isolated, pacified, ousted, and if necessary, handed over to the police. If the movement demonstrates goodwill to the state and its representatives and makes clear that it cannot tolerate any acts of violence under any circumstances, it will surely be received far more sympathetic. Who can blame the police if they have to restore order after some irresponsible, short-minded, and tempered brutes started rioting? All these violent people achieve is giving the state and the media a reason to go after us and crush the protest. End of quote. Apart from pondering why suddenly police violence would be justified, while, quote, violence is never justified, we should be realistic about this. Beginning of quote. The state is not a passive thing. If it wants to repress a movement or organization, it does not wait for an excuse. It manufactures one. About such campaigns, the FBI says, quote, it is immaterial whether facts exist to substantiate the charge. Disruption through the media can be accomplished without facts to back it up. End of quote by Gelderloos. After the uncompromising pacifists have thus succeeded in keeping discontent in acceptable, harmless forms, and the people helpless and dependent on the sudden enlightenment after, quote, speaking truth to power, they have to be rewarded. They can have their protests and their media coverage. Nobody really cares, nothing really changes. Some liberals can feel like real rebels. And most important, the facade of social peace, freedom of speech, and democracy is kept up. Successfully, the ruling class has prevented the possibility of violent resistance, destroying the image of social peace, love, and harmony. Beginning of quote. Permitting nonviolent protest improves the image of the state. Whether they mean to or not, nonviolent dissidents play the role of a loyal opposition in a performance that dramatizes dissent and creates the illusion that democratic government is not elitist or authoritarian. Pacifists paint the state as benign by giving authority the chance to tolerate a criticism that does not actually threaten its continued operation. End of quote by Gelderloos. How can another phenomenon the pacifist movement likes to credit to itself, the so-called, quote, nonviolent revolutions, be explained then? The state and the ruling class were challenged. Maybe they used the police against protesters, but no bloodshed worth speaking of occurred, and definitely no civil war occurred. Yet these regimes collapsed, and the people triumphed. What do we make of all that velvet, orange, rose, and other color revolutions? It is sad, and once again shows the naivety of the nonviolent movement, that you even have to answer such a question. Are they not self-explanatory? What was the result of all these, quote, revolutions? Did they really succeed? Did anything really change for the better? Do people in the countries where these, quote, revolutions occurred now live in a pacifist wonderland? Beginning of long quote. In its long history, this strategy type has not succeeded in causing the class of owners, managers, and enforcers to defect and be disobedient, because their interests are fundamentally opposed to the interests of those who participate in the disobedience. What disobedience strategies have succeeded in doing, time and time again, is forcing out particular government regimes, though these are always replaced by other regimes constituted from among the elite. It is not even proper to say the old regimes are, quote, forced out. Faced with rising disobedience and the threat of real revolution, they choose to hand over power to new regimes that they trust to honor the basic frameworks of capitalism and the state. When they do not have the option of a transfer of power, they take off the gloves, and attempt to brutalize and dominate the movement, which cannot defend itself and survive without escalating tactics. End of quote by Gelderloos, and end of section.